like echo or anything like that that you're hearing? Can anyone please just clarify?
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Ma'am, there is a bit disturbance.
There is a bit of disturbance. I'm just going to stop my video and then maybe. So is this better now?
Yes, ma'am, it's fine now.
Okay, so if there are any issues in the middle and you can't understand anything, or if there's some kind of disturbance, just please uh, put it in the chat box or just speak up. All right,
All right, ma'am.
so let's
Yes, ma'am.
begin. See, so yesterday we discussed narrative beginnings and endings. It is a good thing that my wife, and not a good thing, but it's a good thing that I didn't prepare a presentation for today. Today we'll be reading the section on Michael Joyce's Afternoon, a Story. So if you all turn to page 229 in your text, we'll be focusing on that. Now, the thing with Landau is that he has explained whatever he wanted to explain to us about hypertext. He's taken us through what is the hypertextual beginning like, how is a hypertextual middle like, and what is a hypertextual ending like. Right. So because he's taken us through all of these issues, because he's taken us point by point through them, now we are in a position to start critiquing hypertextual fictions, start critiquing hypertextual literatures, and that is what Landau intends us to do from now on. So the next few sections are going to be devoted to critical analysis of different hypertextual fictions that he's been talking about in this chapter and in the previous chapters that we've also mentioned. And I'm sure you must also know their names at least, even if you haven't looked them up yet. So you must know these names at least from your study of the previous chapters in your syllabus in the previous semester. So Michael Joyce's Afternoon a Story is basically, and I've discussed this in the first or second lectures, that it's a story about a man, and it goes in many directions, but the two main narratives of the story emerge that a man witnesses a car crash, and when he witnesses the car crash, like that's one side of the story. In another side of the story, another narrative, because remember hypertexts are multi-narrative, they have multiple narratives, they are multilinear. So in another direction when we go, he starts thinking that maybe his ex-wife and his son are in that car crash and they are the ones who've been killed. So in those respects, Afternoon a Story is obviously a hypertextual fiction. I in the first presentation I shared with you, or maybe I think in the first presentation when we discussed Afternoon a Story, I've shared a couple of links with you as well. I don't know if you've looked them up yet or not, but if you have time, not if you have time, actually go and look them up once you start reading this section. This section is not focused on the narrative. Okay, this is the first difference that I am going to mention before we actually begin reading. That when we usually critique a text, how do we critique it? If I ask you to critique a novel, or if I ask you to critique a short story, what will be your first step? The first step that you'll think of is to what is it? It is to restore, excuse me, it's to restore the summary. Like you'll first tell me what is it about, what the narrative is about, and then probably you'll begin by critiquing that story. So maybe if you're doing a feminist analysis of a novel, so you'll be like, oh, in this story the characters are feminist or not feminist. They are built this way, they do these things, they commit these actions. So all of these things you'll be talking about, what are they directly related to? They are a direct representation of the narrative. Okay. Now this is something that Landau does not do. In this entire section you will not find a lot of mention of the actual story or the actual narrative. And here you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes. So he's actually, what is he actually doing? He's making a reference to the form of the he's making a reference to the form of the narrative, or the form of Afternoon a Story. And how is he doing that? He is doing that by making a formal critique. Now, I don't know if you know the difference between a formal and a summary based critique, but a formal critique is related to, as it is evident in the name. It's related to the form or the structure, or maybe how it has been written, what kind of devices have been used in that. So that is a formal critique. If you're looking at a content analysis, or if you're looking at a narrative critique, that usually refers to the plot or the characters or other narrative details in that text. So in this case, what we'll find here is an analysis of the form of the story. This point is important, and why I'm stressing this point is that remember that in hypertextual fiction there are multiple narratives. So if I ask you to critique a hypertextual fiction, you will not really be able to find one narrative to critique. There is no one singular narrative to critique, because there is no one singular narrative to critique, or because there is no one single meaning. The only point where we can actually point which we can actually critique, or where we can direct our criticism towards, is the form of the hypertext fiction. So when you're looking at a hypertextual fiction in general, or if you find another hypertextual fiction that you would want to critique, always remember that a critique of its narrative is not really possible because of its multiplicity, because of the diversity of narratives. But a critique of its form is always possible, because within each text block, within each lexia, there is going to be a similarity of form. Okay? Even if there is a plurality of narrative. Remember this when we go through Patchwork Girl, or when we go through any other narrative. Right? So I'm going to maybe start my video, and hopefully it will work. Any disturbance for now?
Ma'am.
No? Yes, no?
No.
No, ma'am, you're
No.
audible to me.
Okay, okay. If it doesn't work, just stop in the middle, because it's very weird not teaching without any kind of video. This entire thing is very strange. I'm sure you're used to it. I am not. So yeah, let's begin anyway. If there's any problem, just stop me in the middle. Huh? Don't just let me go on. Let's begin at 229. We'll first start with the first paragraph. And the first paragraph is going to discuss the closure of Afternoon a Story. I have only given you a brief outline of the story, just in case that you need to contextualize it in your mind, because that is how we usually critique fiction. But remember that this is a formal analysis. Right. So remember all the things that we've been discussing about endings, beginnings, about the middle, about Aristotle, and then we'll apply it, or rather Landau will apply it, and we'll agree or disagree with his claims. The first line, we'll begin with the first line of the first paragraph in this section. Michael Joyce, a hypertext author, is suspicious of closure. In Joyce's Afternoon, a hypertext fiction in 538 lexias, the section appropriately entitled Work in Progress advises readers, this is important, closure is, as in any fiction, a suspect quality, although here it is made manifest. When the story no longer progresses, or when it cycles, or when you tire of the paths, the experience of reading it ends. In other words, Joyce makes the responsibility for closure, for stopping, entirely the readers. Let's discuss this point. Yesterday we talked about endings, and I said that, and Lando also said that to bring about a closure, to bring about a finality in a narrative, especially in hypertext fiction needs to go back to pre-hypertextual forms. It needs to take its cues, and it needs to, adopt those devices which have been used by pre-hypertext authors, like, partial closures or multiple closures, or any of these devices, like some kind of closure but then a new beginning, like in sequel. So these devices must be used by hypertextual fiction, because the problem of closure has been existent, like it is an eternal problem. People have faced the problems of closure from the beginning. Right. So this is something that he said, and this is where we stop today. Now, what he's saying is that, remember the point about the author reader. He says that, and he's going to reiterate this point throughout this section. He says that if a reader can make meaning out of a hypertext fiction, if a reader can create his own narrative, if a reader can choose his own narrative, choose his own meaning, choose his direction in the narrative, then he can also choose the point of closure. Okay, he's just going to say that if there is an infinite book, and if there is an infinite hypertextual fiction, because hypertext fictions are theoretically infinite, because if it's theoretically infinite, then the point where the reader decides to stop reading, or the point where the reader says ki, yes, this is enough for today, that is also a moment of closure. He says ki there is no need to formally write the end, just as Landau said about beginnings कि sometimes hypertextual authors जो है they write begin here or start here in the beginning of the hypertext fiction. Landau says कि there is no similar need to write the end at the end of a hypertextual fiction. No, the point where the reader decides to stop for the day or stop for the time, that is a closure. That will be taken as a closure. So in this respect, author readers not only dominate how they will travel through a narrative, they will also tell us how they close a narrative. This is a very important point, please note it down, that hypertextual fictional, the readers of hypertext fiction not only decide where they will begin, they also decide where they will go, in which direction they will go, or what kind of narrative they want to read, but they will also decide what or how that narrative is supposed to end. So the beginning, middle, and end of a hypertextual fiction are not only the responsibility of the author, but that responsibility is also shared and carried on the shoulders of the reader. Therefore, the author-reader relationship, when I say that readers in hypertextual fiction are readers and authors as well, I mean that they are readers and authors for all three segments of a narrative, which is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Is this one clear? Does anybody have any problems? Very important point, guys. So if you don't understand it, I will explain it again.
Ma'am, could you please explain the word polarity
I'm sorry, could
you
you
have
please
used?
explain?
The word polarity you have used.
Polarity? I haven't
The
used that.
polarity, you have used polarity in the narrative.
Plurality in the narratives ki they have multiple narratives, na. So I was tired of seeing multiple narratives. This is why I said ki they have plural narratives. Plural is what? More than one. Multiple also holds the same meaning. It's just a synonym. There's nothing to worry about. I'm just saying ki because you take so many directions in a hypertextual fiction, so each direction becomes a narrative. Therefore, hypertextual fictions have multiple narratives, or they have plural narratives. That's all. Is this clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any other point? Okay, we move on. Remember this point because we're going to talk about this later. So in the first paragraph, he's saying that closure is also designated by the reader author. Okay, just like beginnings and middles are. Come to the next paragraph, first line. The successive lexias one encounters seem to take form as chains of narrative. Now he's going to discuss the interconnectedness of a hypertextual fiction. Okay, he's going to say that narratives are interconnected with each other. Remember Ricoeur's notion of followability. That is something that was applied here, even though he's not explicitly saying it. He's going to quote more from Paul Ricoeur. But remember that notion of followability and how I've described it as a following of events. So that is what he's talking about, how events in hypertextual fiction are interconnected. They're like links in a chain. One block leads to the next block, leads to the next block. Right. Successive Lexia's one encounters seem to take form as chains of narrative, and despite the fact that one shifts setting and narrator, one's choices produce satisfying narrative sets. Okay, whenever I'm stressing some kind of phrase, please just mark it. So, narrative sets here is an important phrase. Moving from section to section, every so often one encounters puzzling changes of setting, narrator, subject, or chronology. But two things occur. After reading a while, one begins to construct narrative placements. So again, the same thing as narrative sets. So what do you start doing? So for example, if you have 100 blocks of lexias in front of you, right? So if you have these blocks of lexias, what do you do? You start reading, you start going through them one by one. Like maybe your first random option is to choose the first lexia, then the third, then the fifth. Maybe you're going that way, or in another option you're going to 2 and then 10, then 15, then 20. Whatever path you're taking through these 100 lexias, some kind of organizing principle in your brain, some kind of unifying principle in your brain is trying to make sense, is trying to create meaning. This is what we discussed yesterday, day before yesterday, when we were discussing the morality and ideology section of our chapter. The the critical point to discuss was that all of these social constructs that we're facing, or all of the things that we keep on thinking about, they are basically a product of the unifying processes of our brain, the impulse towards organization or the impulse towards unity that we carry with us in our lives. Things are either black or white. We don't like gray things. We like them to be black or white. We like them to be unified. We like things to be classified or categorized into different sections. So think about that, and then let's read again. So that one assigns particular sections to a provisionally suitable place. One assigns particular sections to provisionally suitable place, in the sense one assigns some kind of these sections to a certain sphere. Okay, maybe these characters, these sections mention a particular character, so I'm going to group them together, and then these sections or these blocks of text refer to some other kind of character, so they will be classified separately. This is something that we do unconsciously. Our brain keeps on doing this involuntarily throughout the day, right? And that is how we read fiction. Some lexias obviously have several alternate or rival forms of relation. Then, having assigned particular sections to particular sequences, many of which one can retrace at will, one reaches points at which one's initial cognitive dissonance or puzzlement disappears and one seems satisfied. One has reached or created closure. Go back to the statement that we discussed yesterday about the expectations of a narrative which are met by the closure. So that is what he's saying. Whenever you read a fiction, it's any kind of fiction, whether it's hypertextual or pre-hypertextual, what are you doing? You are basically creating a story in your head. You're thinking of the character, you're creating a story in your head. You have certain expectations about the character which keeps changing, about his life, about his work, about the person that he or she is in love with, and by the end you start developing certain notions, certain ideas about how that narrative might end. And when that narrative ends, either your notions are satisfied, either you leave dissatisfied, and that is where it ends. He says a similar thing happens in hypertextual fiction. So you follow a certain path through these blocks of text, and once you start going through them, even though they're very random, sometimes your brain inevitably will start categorizing them, will start classifying them into different sections. Once your brain starts classifying them, then you will start understanding them in the sense of, okay, this category has these kinds of characters, this category has separate characters, and this kind of narrative has separate characters. Once you start reading through them, once you start understanding these characters by the process of classification, you will reach a point where you have certain expectations about those characters. And then finally, when you go to the next block of text, or further blocks of text, because remember that afternoon story has 538 lexia. So 538 lexia in the sense 538 pages. So you go through the text, and then you start meeting those expectations, or those expectations become very unsatisfactory for you, and that is how closure is achieved. Very similar to how we achieve closure in a normal book. So sometimes even in books, you have alternating chapters. So one chapter will tell the story of a particular character. The next chapter will tell the story of a particular character. You have to keep in mind which story belongs to which character, right? Or whose voice are you do you like most, or whose voice connects how to some other voice. I hope you've read such fictions, because those are very interesting. You understand one story through so many multiple voices, right? So this is the same thing here. Come to the next, the quotation here. So he's going to quote Gerard Genet. So Gerard Genet wrote a passage, or sorry, critique Stendhal. So Stendhal was a Russian writer. You don't need to know anything more than that. Stendhal wrote a very famous book called The Red and the Black. It's a sad book. So if you want to read it, just make sure that you have time to come out of the sadness. Yeah, so Stendhal's work is, what he's basically saying is, if you read one Stendhal book, just like understand that you read all of them. So all of his work is basically very similar, and if you've read one, you've read all of them. And he says that what Gerard Genet has said about Stendhal applies directly to Joyce and indirectly also to hypertextual fiction. So let's read. One might describe Joyce's hypertext fiction in the way Gerard Genet describes what one calls Stendhal's oeuvre. A fragmented, divided into blocks of text, elliptical in the sense it is interconnected also, Repetitive, yes, obviously, because it has different characters who are repeating throughout it. Infinite because hypertexts are theoretically infinite, or at least indefinite. Indefinite or infinite may, what is the difference? So indefinite is that you're unclear whether this is infinite or not. Okay, infinite is theoretically infinite. There is complete surety, complete certainty to the fact that this thing has no end. Now it is for you to decide. When I say 538 lexias, you already have a finite number of lexias. So you know that to go from point 1, the first lexia, to the 538 lexia, math can probably, corroborate or create a limited number of pathways, because you know that there are 538 lexias. So once say 538 के बीच में however many paths are possible, you can actually collate them according to mathematics. But even then, in that sense, also those paths are going to seem infinite. So do not think of infinity in the form of physics or how science has taught us कि infinity means that there is no end. Just think about it in terms of magnitude. कि there are so many multiple, numerous paths which can be followed from 1 to 538 that we call hypertextual fiction, theoretically infinite. Obviously, if you see a hypertextual fiction, you can always find out how many blocks of text are there. But are you prepared to go or take every path which is possible from 1 to 538? Right? I don't think anybody is. So, in that sense, infinity is how we attach the epithet of infinity to hypertextual fiction. Whoever pulls a single thread must take, or at least indefinite text, no part of which, however, may be separated from the whole. Again, this is very important, and he's going to come back to this later. This kind of no part of which may be separated from the whole. So I'll explain it then. Whoever pulls a single thread must take the whole cloth with its holes and its lack of edges. To read Stendhal is to read the whole of Stendhal. Okay, to read one book is to read everything, right? And to read one chapter is to indefinitely read the entire book. Now, not only does this mean that Stendhal writes in the same way, therefore every book is the same, but it also means that there is such an intricate whole and part relationship in Stendhal that to read one chapter is to understand how he writes. Okay, this is a very critical point. There are two assumptions which are based in this. To read Stendhal is to read the whole of Stendhal. So this means that every Stendhal book also almost deals with the same thematic concerns. It's written in the same style. Therefore, if you've read one, you've read everything. Right, that is the first meaning. The second meaning is a deeper meaning. He says that within a chapter, within a book of Stendhal, there are so many different chapters. If you've read one chapter, that is to say that you've understood the way that Stendhal writes, you've understood the style of his writing, which is actually a compliment to Stendhal. In the same way, if you're going to read hypertextual fiction, if you've read one block of text, that means if you've read one hypertextual fiction, it is going to follow the same formal concerns. Thematic nahi, because every hypertextual fiction has different characters, but it is going to be in the same form. So, for example, Joyce's Afternoon Story and Subway Story share very formal characteristics. You can choose your way, you can choose your way. There are multiple directions in both, so formally they might be the same, but when you read Joyce in general, if you go through one of his blocks of texts, you can't really take apart that text. You can't really just read that one block of text and say that you've read Joyce completely, because that part cannot be separated from the entirety of the hypertext fiction. So hypertext fiction like Stendhal, or Stendhal like hypertext fiction, exists in a unification of meaning. We'll come to this point in a couple of pages. Okay, come to the next page, second paragraph. Third line. Even entering at a single point determined by the author, the reader chooses one path or another and calls up another lexia by a variety of means, and then repeats this process until he or she finds a hole or a gap. Perhaps at this point, the reader turns back and takes another direction. Again, he's trying to explain how readers go through a narrative, and what these lines illustrate is how a narrative is interconnected. So you cannot separate one block of a text, you cannot take it out and say, okay, this is what hypertextual fiction is like. No, a hypertextual fiction exists in unity. Okay, this is a point he'll make again and again. You have to discuss the whole of hypertextual fiction. You can't discuss a part, which is why he's not discussing a single block of text. He's not discussing the plot of the story, because he says to understand a hypertextual fiction, you have to discuss the entirety of that hypertextual fiction. Not only just like take one block out of it and say, oh, this is the meaning of that. No, a formal analysis is required, a whole analysis is required. Come to the next paragraph. Now that he's talked about closures, he's talked about the interconnectedness. Now he's going to talk about disjunction. Now he's going to talk about fragmentation. Okay. Because hypertextual narratives are so diverse, hypertextual narratives have everything, so they can be simultaneously unified and fragmented, simultaneously collective, a whole, and also disjunctive. Disjunctive in the sense separated. Okay, let's read. Whereas Genette's characterization of the Stendhalian oeuvre captures the reader experience of the interconnectedness. Remember that's what we were talking about of afternoon and other hypertext fictions. His description of temporality in Proust conveys the experience of encountering the disjunctions and jumps of hypertextual narrative. So therefore, a hypertextual narrative has interconnectedness. It also has disjunctions in the sense that one block of text is not connected to another block of text. This we've discussed so many times, that one block of text is not connected. It is connected because there is a followability. One block of text followed by another block of text. But this block of text might have different characters. This block of text might have separate characters. So in that sense, there might be a change of story. There might be a disjunction, a disturbance, a disruption of narratives. Okay, this hypertext fiction might talk about something else, and this another block of text might talk about something else. Okay, come to the, so he's going to talk about Proust now. So these guys that they're talking about, Proust or Stendhal, they're not important. What is important is what they're saying about this. Okay, because Landau is going to, what is Landau, what has Landau told you, how to deal with closure? He's told you to go and look at pre-hypertextual fiction. He said, okay, before hypertext was popular, go and look at novels like print material. Go and look at them and see how they decided to convert, or how they decided to change, how they decided to close a novel or to end it, or to finalize an ending. How did they decide to do it? So in a similar way, what he's also doing is key, because there is not a lot of criticism that exists for hypertextual narratives, he's going to pre-hypertext fiction, he's going to printed fiction. Like, so we get examples from James Joyce, not Michael Joyce, James Joyce. We get examples from Tennyson, we get examples from Eliot. Now we're talking about Stendhal, then we're talking about Proust. So these people are not necessarily important. What is important is what has been said about them, and how that thing which has been said is being applied to the study of hypertext fiction. Okay, context, there is a change in context. So these assertions which were made by Genette on Stendhal, or which were made by some other person on Proust, these assertions are the ones that are important. So don't try to remember who made them or what they're talking about. That is not important. What is important is what was being said, and how the context has now changed from pre-hypertextual fiction, and it is being now applied to hypertext fiction. Okay, let's read. So he's going to discuss a la recherche du temps perdu. So if you want to Google, it's a very difficult book to read. It's called In Remembrance of Things Past. It's a book by Proust. I don't know anything else about it. You're free to look this up yourselves. We read this during our bachelor's in at Delhi University, and it was one of the most difficult things that I had to go through. If you want some more information on it, you can obviously go and Google it. Okay, but let's read what he's talking about here. Can a disjunction be sorted by relating it to any familiar lexia? Yes, of course, of course. That is what he was saying. Na, ki once you start reading, so you go through 100, that's the example I gave, right? You go through 100 lexia. Some of them will be talking about, say, Peter. Some of them will be talking about Peter's child. And some others will be talking about a separate woman called Lela. So all these three, there are three different characters: Peter's dog, and another woman called Lela. So once you start reading these lexias, you will automatically be sorting them. Okay, this is a lexia about Peter. This is a lexia about his dog. This is a lexia about Lela. Maybe this is a lexia about all three of them together. Right. So that is how that kind of that kind of unity will be made. So disjunction can be solved by connecting them to other separate texts, by making sense of these stories. But remember, you are the one who's making sense of these stories. The author is not doing that for you. The author has written what he's written and left it to you. Now you are the one who has to sit there, and your brain is the one that is trying to make sense. Okay, so in that sense, a hypertextual fiction is obviously authorially, ठीक है, originally or from the perspective of the author, it is always going to be disjunctive. You are the one who's creating meaning out of it. Okay, so he's going to say कि in Proust, time appears as a succession of isolated moments. This is the 7th line from the top in the second paragraph on 231. He's going to say that time is a succession of isolated moments. Come to 4 lines below this. Indeed, many of the characters assume the most contradictory roles simultaneously. Okay, this is another section. This is another important critical point, that characters assume the most contradictory roles simultaneously. So the stories of Peter, his dog, and the woman called Leila are going on together at a single point in time. Okay, this is of critical importance here, that what you're basically reading, okay, is an expression, is are characters who are performing these actions simultaneously. This expression of simultaneity, okay, this is simultaneity. Simultaneity, this expression of simultaneity is a very core post-structural concept. Okay, the post-structuralists believed that to express meaning as diverse, you needed to have characters, or you needed to have actions which happen in one place. Okay, in one place, or maybe not even one place, these actions must happen at the same time. These actions must be performed simultaneously by a variety of different actors. Right, so this expression of simultaneity is very important, and it is seen in hypertextual fiction, where you can talk about multiple characters at once. And in your imagination, you have to believe that all those actions are being performed simultaneously. Please remember that that does not mean that if a block of text has, you know, the date 1960s and another block of text has the date 1980s, so you're telling me, ki, oh ma'am, these actions are not being performed simultaneously. Again, we're not looking at a content analysis, we're looking at a formal analysis. In your head, when you're reading these 538 lexias, you're categorizing them into different categories simultaneously. These actions for you are being performed simultaneously. I'm not talking about the plot or the content of the narrative, I'm talking about your reading of that narrative. In your reading, those actions come across as simultaneous. Okay, that is what he's saying here. Come to the fourth last line in this, or 2 lines below what we were just reading. In a hypertext narrative, it is the author who provides multiple possibilities by means of which the readers themselves construct temporal succession and choose characterization. Again, what I'm saying, in your head, like in your head, you classify these events. In your head, you say, oh, you know, this happened and then this happened, or maybe something happened which happened before these events. So this is something that you're doing. This classification is something which depends upon the reader, not the author. The author has written his text and he's left. Everything else that you do depends on you. Your paths through the narrative will decide what events you encounter first. So you are left to make sense of those narratives also alone. So they choose characterization. Again, come to the next paragraph. Now he is going to really, hammer down on this meaning. Ki readers create their own meaning. This is the essential point that he's trying to make in this entire section. That readers create their own beginnings. They choose their own beginnings. They find their own middles, and they choose their own closures. So this is the point that he's making. Now he's really going to reiterate it. Yes, so many different contexts cross and interweave that one must work to place the characters encountered in them. Work, like do mental work. Joyce's world, which also inevitably includes the other Joyce. The other, what Joyce is he talking about? Joyce's world in the beginning refers to Michael Joyce, the one who's written Afternoon, a Story. The other Joyce, when he's talking about the other Joyce is James Joyce, the one who wrote Finnegan's Wake, the one who wrote Dubliners, and those works we already talked about a bit about them in the beginning, in the initial lectures on hypertext fiction, when I said that James Joyce and people like Tennyson or Eliot share some characteristics of hypertextual fiction even before the digital age. So refer back to those lectures. It has many moving centers of interest, very important phrase, many moving centers of interest, many points where these characters commingle, many points, many different characters, many different settings, many different ideologies. So many centers of interest which your brain has to work and make sense of. Come to the line after this. Reading habits one has learned from print. Okay, important line. Reading habits that you have learned from reading print fiction play a role in organizing these materials. Exactly, that's what I was saying. In some novels or even in some movies, you find that the movie will begin with a certain character and something will happen with that character. Then the movie will definitely start and it will be a completely different character. And you're like, who is that first character? What happened to him? But the story of that first character will be resolved later in the movie or at the end of the movie. Right. In a similar way, in, for example, thriller narratives or in detective novels, what happens is in the beginning, you have a person who does the crime, okay, or you have a detective who's sitting there and somebody tells him, ki, oh, somebody has done a crime, can you please investigate? And then he starts investigating, and what does he do? He goes back to the beginning of that crime. So what you're basically doing in these kind of narratives is traveling back in time. But when you read these narratives or watch these movies, do you really think like this? You don't. Your brain makes sense of those events naturally. It comes very naturally to you to organize them on the basis of time, to organize them on the basis of characters, to organize them on the basis of settings. Even settings are different. Sometimes stories are set in multiple places, but your brain makes sense of that. You don't really have to think about it. This is what he's saying. The habits that we see, that we take up from reading print fiction or from watching movies, those are the habits we use to classify hypertextual fictions, which is why hypertextual fictions, even though they are so disjunctive, even though they are so fragmented, make complete sense to us. We don't really have to think a lot to make sense of hypertextual narratives. It's an involuntary process of the creation of meaning. It's an involuntary process. It happens very naturally. Right. Come to the next page. I'll just read one thing and then we'll stop. Page 232, first paragraph, नीचे से fourth line. Our assistance in the storytelling or story making is not entirely or even particularly random, since Joyce provides many hooks that can catch at our thoughts, but we do become reader authors and help tell the tale we read. Very important line, help tell the tale we read. Right. The very critically important here कि you tell your own tale or you narrate your own story, even if you reading a narrative which might seem very disjointed, which might seem very fragmented, you are the one who's creating your own kind of story. And sooner or later, that expectations you're building up, the expectations you're building up throughout the narrative will be satisfied. Right. And once they're satisfied, then you'll be able to, close the book. And how will you have closed the book? By taking your own path through the story and by choosing your own kind of meaning. So, any questions at this point? Anything that you did not understand? Okay, so I'm going to stop this now and we'll meet next week. So 13th and 14th are holidays, right? But I'll be seeing you on the 15th, hopefully. And if not, I will obviously tell you a couple of days in advance. But I'll try to finish this section before I leave. So I'll see you on the 15th. Have a happy couple of days of holidays. Okay? Any other questions you might have?
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll put these up today and for sure.
Thank you,
So
ma'am.
we'll talk about them later. Okay. Bye.